If you are lost in the spiritual universe, this might be your opportunity to get more lost. But hopefully not. Hopefully you'll actually be a little clearer about where things stand at the end of this. Let's hope, because that's the objective. We're in chapter 18. That's page 76, if you're looking inside the book. The reason we're talking about the spiritual universe is because we're trying to find out where we live. And that's not just because, what's the expression? You're a long way from home. No, I'm not talking to you. What does it mean to be a long way from home? The neshama is all the way down here on earth. That's not where souls come from. Souls belong in a different reality at a higher level. It's the level of connection to Hashem, etc., etc. So to be in the reality that we live in, which is so limited, we're a long way from home. As a result of that, some people live without recognizing what their neshama's potential is. And that means that some people don't ever realize that built into us, hardwired into our system, baked into our soul, there is a love for Hashem. We don't feel that. Do you feel that? I don't know. Some people have a love of coffee, some people have a love of whiskey, some people have a love of good watches, some people have a love for fast cars. So, but a love of Hashem, listen, it's a nice theory, not necessarily something I actually relate to. So that started us on a journey of saying, well, hang on a second, if there is this concept of having love of Hashem that is supposed to be part of who we are, it's supposed to be baked into our essence, how come we're not feeling it? So that was the one side of the conversation, right? Why we're not feeling it. And the easy answer to that is because it's quite possible for a person to have something that is very much part of who they are, but circumstances don't allow them to get in touch with it. Fine, that makes sense. But that got us into another part of the conversation, which is where we are now, and that is, look at those people. Those people, obviously not at this table, obviously. But those people, they're those people that they're just so spiritually unaware. It's as if they're walking around with fog in their heads. They just don't get it. They don't appreciate the power and value of their own souls. They are never inspired. In fact, to the contrary, they're actually fighting a war against their own spiritual connection. So what about them? Do they also have this? Do they also have a connection? Do they also have this inbuilt love of Hashem? Doesn't sound feasible. So we said, if you want to understand that, you've got to understand the landscape. You need to understand the spiritual universe. You need to understand the nature of the back doors, the trap doors, the hyperlinks, the portals, the wormholes, whatever it is that link you between one reality and the other. And so that's what got us into this conversation about mapping out, I shouldn't say the spiritual universe, mapping out part of the spiritual universe. That would probably be the more accurate way to say this, right? We want to map out a certain part of the spiritual universe so we can understand how things work, how neshamas connect, even when they feel so disconnected. Okay, so that's where we are in the conversation. Let's start at the bottom. Like any skyscraper, you're going to enter at ground level, or in our case, actually in the basement, which is nefesh, de nefesh. Remember this? Nefesh, de nefesh, de malchus, da asiya. If nothing else, by the time we're finished with this particular stretch, everybody will be able to say those words. Nefesh, the malchus, da asiya. Which is great because it also becomes like a little bit of a Friday night party trick. When you sit at the table with your people on Shabbos, you could throw out and say, do you know anybody who has a nefesh, the malchus, da asiya? And your guests will look at you as if you fell from the moon. And you say, oh, you don't understand what that is. Let me explain. And then you can really test your skills. So what is nefesh, the malchus, da asiya? So we identified that a soul can be experienced at 5 levels. The level of least experience, the level of most concealment is called nefesh. Every level of the soul experience can also be experienced at 5 levels. So therefore, you could have what's called nefesh, de nefesh. That means somebody who is experiencing the very least developed part of their soul in the least developed way. Let's try and make that relatable for a moment. Every experience that a person has could be experienced in different ways. For example, and I know this is not fair to compare a neshama to this, but let's just use it as an example. When a person goes to a fine dining experience, yes? Imagine going to a fine dining experience. Can you imagine going to a kosher fine dining experience? Right? Some people tell you that's an oxymoron, right? So you go to a kosher fine dining experience. And what happens? You're sitting over there. You can have 3 people at 3 different tables having 3 different dining experiences. The one person comes in, they look at the menu, it's got things that you cannot pronounce, and they just want the burger. Because I know what a burger is, I know what it does, and I know I like it. So please don't give me things that have French-sounding names with their letters that you're not supposed to pronounce. I just want something I could relate it, they have a burger. Or the person who takes them out for dinner says, listen here, you've come to this restaurant, you don't come to this restaurant for a burger. To this restaurant, you have a steak. You have a steak? Okay, so I'm going to have the steak. So then the waiter comes along and says, how would you like your steak? How would you like your steak, right? They don't even know the words. They don't even know what the choices are. Steak. I normally have a burger. I want to have a steak. So say, listen, we advise that you have the steak, medium rare. Okay, fine. That's what you advise. That's what I'm going to have. What kind of sauce would you like with your steak? I have no concept. What are you talking about? This sauce or that sauce, whatever. Anyway, eventually they put the whole thing together. The steak comes along. Person takes their knife and fork, has a piece. Oh, it's delicious steak. They are having one experience of the dining experience. The next person sitting, it could even be at the same table, it doesn't have to be at a different table. The next person at the same table is having an experience where they sit there and they say, I want it to be charred on the outside and rare on the inside, and you must do this kind of a basting, and I need to know, is it tenderized? And has it been in marinade, and for how long has it been marinating, and what are the sides going to be, and at this is the temperature it needs to come at, and the whole thing, whatever. And then they sit there and they give you a drosha. It's very uncomfortable to sit with somebody who, while you're eating, is giving you a drosha. It's a whole drosha. This has got layers of flavor, they tell you. It's got layers of flavor, and it's got an infusion of this and a hint of that, and and you sitting there, the person sitting across who normally has a burger but now is having a steak because they don't want to insult the host, they don't know anything about layers of taste. They don't know about layers of a burger. That I can understand. There's layers because you can see this one's the bread layer, that one's the tomatoes, that's the lettuce, that's the onion, that's the thing. And those are layers I understand. These layers I don't understand. It all looks to me just like a steak. What do you mean there's layers of things? And then they're going on about how this reminds me of this other restaurant that I went to. That becomes a whole nostalgic experience. It's a different experience of eating. And then you get somebody else who, for them, it's not just about the fact that it's a steak, and it's not just about the fact that it's got all these layers of flavor and infusions and myces and garnishes and whatever. It's about how it's plated. For them, you eat with your eyes, right? So it's not just about the culinary experience. It looks at it, look how they presented it, so beautiful, and this and that, and the angles, and it's got this trickled on it, and a piece of rosemary on top, and this and whatever. Oh, this is very geschmack. So what have you got? You've got 3 different experiences of eating. So you could call them. You could say the one person, for lack of a better term, the one person is having a nefesh experience of eating. That's the burger guy. All he could relate to is a burger, and you happen to put a steak in front of him. So as far as he's concerned, a burger and a steak is the same concept. It's just the one is in a different form. Correct. The other one's been kind of ground up, and this one is still, you got to saw through it with a knife. So it's not as pleasant for him because he just wants to be able to bite directly in. But okay, fine. He's going to have the thing. He's experiencing the nefesh experience. Excuse me saying it, because obviously the neshama is much more advanced and subtle and sublime than all of this. But he's got, like, so to speak, the nefesh experience of eating this at this restaurant. The next person's got like the ruach experience. Oh, there's more to it. There's layers. There's infusion. There's this. It's compared. You could tell this is the so and so chef. It's his trademark of how exactly he does the steak. It's the whole thing. The other guy's having maybe the neshama experience, which is the taste and the flavor and the infusions and the appearance and the plating and the whole ganze experience. Now, if you had to take these 3 diners and instead of taking them to the fine dining experience, you took them, what are they having? Sorry. So they're having a nefesh ruach and neshama experience of a restaurant that's at neshama level. But if the next time you take them to the burger joint down, forget burger, take them to the falafel joint down the road, where the guy came straight out of Hadera somewhere, doesn't speak a word of English. His parents were Iraqi or wherever they came from, Syrian, I don't know exactly what they are. He doesn't understand all these French names and expressions. Falafel is falafel. What do you mean? It's a falafel. You take it, you put it in the pita, and that's it. What do you want? You want hummus? You don't want hummus. It's very simple. So that could be maybe the nefesh kind of dining experience. You come there, you've got to clear off all the stuff of the guy who was before you. You've got to dump it. You've got to wipe the table because it's got the grease of 3 people ago. And you sit down over there. The guy hasn't changed the oil of his falafel fryer for 6 months. And he just puts everything together. This is now you've walked into a nefesh. You've walked into a nefesh restaurant, right? And in the nefesh restaurant, you can have somebody who has a nefesh experience and a neshama experience. Some person, you know what, mightn't be a bit of a greasy joint, but this reminds me, it's nostalgic. I eat this falafel. It reminds me of when I was after school. I spent a year in Israel, and this is what we used to eat. It's a great experience. The other person comes, it's a completely just a nefesh experience, which is, I need food. This is food. I put it in. It gives me some nutrition. Off I go. So in the same way, you have the nefesh de nefesh. That means that the soul experience that is available to this person is highly limited. And then their appreciation of that soul experience is further limited. They're nefesh de nefesh. That's where this person lives. And where in the spectrum of the spiritual universe does this nefesh de nefesh person live? De malchus de asiyah. At the lowest world, asiyah, okay, that's where all humans live typically. But this is malchus of asiyah, the lowest, in other words, the most restricted degree of divine energy. That's where they live. And this is nefesh de malchus de asiyah, which is pretty much a person who walks out of the fine dining restaurant because it says, I'd rather have the greasy falafel, because that's all I can relate to. So don't give me this other stuff that's too sophisticated and too advanced and too spiritual, because it doesn't agree with my system. That's the nefesh de malchus de asiyah person. So our question was, this person who's living at the nefesh de malchus de asiyah level, are you telling me that this person has a built-in, hardwired love towards Hashem? Doesn't look anything like it. That would be the equivalent, again, in our parable, that'd be the equivalent of a guy who goes every meal to the greasy falafel stand, coming in to be a restaurant critic in a Michelin restaurant. Like, you're telling me that this guy actually has a plug-in? Where's the plug-in? How does he even have a plug-in? He doesn't speak the language. So that's what we're trying to explain. Believe it or not, despite all of the failings and shortcomings of his reality, in the nefesh de malchus de asiyah, there is a wormhole. There's a way to connect. What's that connection? Okay, so let's put it back just so everybody can see, because this is where you have to start remembering a whole lot of different locations. It's like the good old days where you had to navigate using the AA maps, and then you didn't know where you were,
and then
right?
you had to fold them.
And then what?
Then you had to fold them.
Yeah, that was harder than getting to your destination, was folding the map away after you had used it. So
I had the book.
the book was equally just difficult, because you get somewhere and then they tell you you've got to turn 14 pages to find where you're supposed to go next. So in the same kind of manner, you've got to know where you are over here. So if you're looking at page 76, then you are going to count up 3, 6, let's call it 8 lines, 9 lines from the bottom of the page. The first line the first word on the line is ha'asiyah. And we're going to start exactly where we started last week, which is with the abbreviation Ve'af al pichein. Do you see that? Ve'af al pichein. I'm going to run through this very quickly just to remind us where we are. Ve'af al pichein me'achashim es first kedoshos. So despite the fact that this person's soul experience is nefesh, the malchus, the asiyah, the very most limited version of a soul experience that you could possibly have, nevertheless, because they live or they're plugged into malchus. So even though malchus is the lowest level of energy, and it's malchus da asiyah, which means it's malchus in the lowest of all the experiences of existence, nevertheless it's malchus. Malchus is mi eses first gedoshos. It is one of the 10 energies, the 10 sephiros that Hashem uses to create the world. That means it doesn't behave in the same way as our reality behaves. Our reality, either you're here or you're there. Either you're switched on or you're switched off. We live in a very binary reality where you've got to choose. Are you up or are you down? Are you engaged or are you disengaged? Are you inspired or are you apathetic? Right? Those are the realities. So are you a nefesh or are you a neshama? That's the reality we live in. But now we're talking about the environment in which that nefesh, the nefesh, is living. What's that environment? It's malchus. What is malchus? That's a piece of divine energy, what we call a sphira, one of Hashem's 10 attributes or expressions of his essence. Hashem doesn't behave with our constraints. Hashem doesn't have our limitations. Therefore, he kulon mikulan. So therefore, the first thing you have to know is, in Hashem's reality, everything is comprised of everything. That's the first thing you have to know. Now, technically, the physical reality is not dissimilar. Because at a molecular level, you could say that the same molecules that make up humans are the same molecules that make up everything. It's just how those molecules are put together. But fundamentally, the quarks at the bottom, at the basic building blocks of existence are the same right across the board. Doesn't matter who you are, right? Doesn't matter what you are. So in a certain sense, you could say everything is klulam yikulam, everything is kind of combined of everything else. But when you talk about Hashem, it's a much more profound concept. Why? Because the most difficult thing for us to understand about Hashem, besides the fact that we can't understand Hashem, so the most difficult thing to understand about Hashem is the idea that Hashem is one. It's one of the most difficult things for us to know. It's probably the most difficult thing for us to understand. To understand Hashem is not possible, so it's not even worth the conversation. You can't understand Hashem. But to understand that Hashem is one is extremely difficult for us, because in our reality, if something is one, does that mean it's one in a system? Like it is one and then there are two? Or does it mean one as in it's in a class of its own, so it's the only one? Now, obviously, when we were talking about Hashem, we want to say the latter, right? We want to say that Hashem is in a class of his own. We want to say, not God forbid, that Hashem is part of a system and he's just the first in the system. That would be ridiculous. So obviously, we mean to say that Hashem is in a class of his own. But that's not what we mean when we say that Hashem is one. Not just that he's in a class of his own. What we want to say is, if we say Hashem is one, that means that Hashem is one. There is no two. That's what we want to say when we say that Hashem is one. Why do I say what we want to say? Because we can't really comprehend it. It's not part of our reality. In our reality, there is no such thing that we can identify, that we could relate to, which is only. Everything else is one of. And that would be a ridiculous thing, for example, for a person to say, I'm the only human that exists. That's rubbish. There are 8 billion other people besides you. You don't have to go to the level of 8 billion. Sitting around this table, there's enough people to illustrate that I'm not the only person. I might be a very arrogant person who believes I'm the only person, but I'd be wrong. Okay? So just because a person has a delusion doesn't make it real. So it's impossible for us to understand that Hashem is one. Why? Because I look around, I don't see Hashem. I see you. You're all different. Then there's a table which is different to you. Then there's a room that we're in. Then there are the books that we're reading. Then there are the shelves, the lights, the little microbes that are running around, the dust mites that are in the carpet. I don't know there's so many things. So for us, it's impossible to know that Hashem is one. So clearly, it must be something that exists at a level that is beyond our true comprehension, but to the best of our understanding, we're supposed to try and understand it. Here's one little insight. Klulam mikulam. If every piece of the system is comprised of the entire system, that is one. Okay? Can I picture it? Probably not. Can I associate it with something that we know about our world? Maybe. There might be things in our world that help me to understand this, but to really wrap my head around that concept is kind of above our pay grade. But the notion is a powerful notion. If Hashem is one, that means that every component of the system must be the entire system.
But we can appreciate it.
We can appreciate it, but I don't think we can visualize it.
Yeah, but we can appreciate it.
Intellectually appreciate it. Not only can we, that's actually what we're supposed to do. When we say Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, that's actually what we're supposed to be thinking. Or to some extent, some variation of this understanding. So that's quite something, because in our reality, and this is obviously what we're going to do. In our reality, we're going to obviously judge things by our reality. That's all we know. You can't expect us to know other things. So in our reality, if somebody said nefesh, malchus, dasir, which is the bottom of the pile, clearly they can't be connected to the top of the pile. It doesn't make sense. There are just so many other layers in between. In our reality. In our reality, if the guy's the janitor in the building, he can't be linked into the executive decisions of the company. Doesn't make sense. There are too many layers. Even if he were to try and climb that corporate ladder, he wouldn't have the capacity to do so, because he doesn't necessarily have the educational level to get through the door. So it doesn't make sense in our world that the guy who's cleaning the basement floors is going to make the executive decisions about the future of the company. It just doesn't make sense. Too many layers. So therefore, in our reality, if it's a nefesh to malchus dasiyah, if it's the lowest part of the neshama, it doesn't make sense that it should have any connection to that very deep essence of a soul that is plugged into Hashem and has this conscious, visceral feeling of love to Hashem. It doesn't make sense to us. Okay, That's because we're looking at our system. Now let's look from Hashem's system. If you're in Hashem's, one of his spheroids, one of his energy packs, every piece of the system contains the whole system. I don't know what that looks like. I can appreciate it intellectually. I don't know what it looks like. But that is the key to understanding how hierarchy is not a barrier to connection, which is a very powerful thought. Hierarchy is not a barrier to connection. In any finite system, hierarchy is very much a barrier to connection. But when the minute you're talking about a system that defies finite rules, then hierarchy is actually irrelevant, so there's no barrier to access. Okay, what does that actually mean? So let's read. So, because it's from Hikrulim Kulon, therefore, this Malchus level actually incorporates all of the other levels of Hashem's expression. Gam mechochma da'asiyah. Let's start with the one that is, in a sense, most relatable. Within Malchus of Asiyah, there's a plug-in to Chochma of Asiyah. So Malchus of Asiyah is the lowest spiritual level within that dimension called Asiyah, our dimension. And Chochma Asiyah is the highest level within our dimension called Asiyah. Last week, we were able to actually logically explain why there's a link between Malchus and Chochmah, right? Why is that? Because Malchus, at least in human experience, and we're supposed to reflect on human experience to really understand how these things work. So in human experience, Malchus is the point where I'm about to leave the safety of self to be able to share with others. That's really what Malchus is. And everybody's very safe inside themselves. Have you ever, I'm sure some people here can say with certainty that they have. Some people maybe not as much, not everybody wants to expose themselves. But if you ever sat with a group of people where you have to be absolutely vulnerable,
Yes.
Yeah.
and no, I'm not asking if you have, I'm saying if you have, right? I hope that everybody has had such an opportunity, right? When you sit with people that you be absolutely vulnerable, it's quite liberating. Till it happens, it's altogether intimidating. Once it happens, it's very liberating. And part of that liberating feeling is, my sharing could inspire somebody else. So sharing equals Malchus. Inspiration equals Chochmah. There's a link between Malchus and Chochmah. But there's another layer to this, which is my sharing could inspire me. So my Malchus could instigate my own Chochmah. And the best example of that is when you try and teach somebody. Why do I say try and teach? Because there's no guarantee that you'll actually teach. That's not in your control. You can only do the best that you can. You don't know what the other person's capacity is going to be, right? When you try and teach somebody, what inevitably happens is you actually gain insight into the subject matter that you would never have had you never tried to teach it. Which is why the very best way to actually understand something is to teach. It's exponential, it really is, right? That's why they say that there's quite a lot of science for this now, that when a person is studying, let's say for an exam, studying by way of teaching consolidates the material way better than the classic studying that people do, which is basically just sit in their room and read books and make notes.
Funny, that's how I used to study.
Many people, right? Pretend you're talking to somebody else. Exactly.
Class in front of me.
So there you go. So there's a lot of science. There's a lot of science that bears that out, right?
I thought I was mad.
Maybe that's unrelated. So anyway, but the point is that in a spiritual sense, the reason that teaching stimulates a whole new perspective is because Malchus is linked to Chochmah. Even it's not what you would expect to find the Chochmah. You don't expect it. You expect to find the Chochmah in the quiet of your own time, to be able to think and to brainstorm and innovate, whatever the case is. But in truth, it's actually in that sharing that stimulates the highest part of the system, the Chochmah of the system. So straight away, there's a link between Malchus in this lowest reality called Asiyah, with Chochmah at the top of this lowest reality called Asiyah. That's our first hyperlink. But then he says more than that. The Malchus Tatzilis. Now this is pretty much where we got up to last week. Within Chochmah of Asiyah, you have access to Chochmah of Malchus of Atzilus. Now, the reason we didn't get much further than this last week is because in this one line we have now packed in a lot of information. And it's really important that we revisit and understand what this information is. And I know, Leah, you said last week we should do a chart and a drawing and a diagram and all that kind of stuff. And it would work just in terms of showing the relationship between the different levels. It wouldn't work to give us the perspective on how those levels actually interact. So for the sake of understanding and being able to move forward, this is what we need to know. There are 4 experiences of reality, which we call the 4 worlds.
Yeah.
The very highest of all of those is called Atzilus. The very lowest of all of them is called
Malchut.
Asiya.
Oh,
No,
Asiya.
Asiya. These are the experiences of reality. These are the worlds. These are the dimensions. 4 dimensions. Each dimension.
But you've only worded 2.
Correct. So I said Atzilus all the way at the top, and Asiya is all the way at the bottom. In between is Beriah and Yetzirah, which we're not getting into in this conversation. Okay. We haven't yet discussed what the difference is between Asiya and Atzilus, which is a very, very important difference. We touched on it briefly last week. We really have to visit. But before that, these 4 dimensions, Atzilus, Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya, all work on the same system. What's the system called? What's the system that each dimension, each reality works on? Sephiros, right? The 10 Sephiros. That is what each of these systems works on. Which means, in the dimension called Atzilus, the range of experiences is across 10 layers or 10 hierarchies, which are called the 10 Sephiros. Each of the 10 Sephiros is a self-contained system of 10 facets of Sephiros. So, in other words, a complete dimension really has 100 variations of experience. Okay? Now, of course, add into that the uniqueness of each individual, and obviously each person has 100 unique experiences that are accessible to them. It doesn't mean that you access the 100, but that's kind of the reality.
Just like that again, it's like each Sephiros.
Each one of the Sephiros has within it a mini Sephiros system, so that each one of them is its own self-contained 10-faceted system.
And
Therefore,
isn't it times 4?
each dimension is 100
This
facets.
is like quantum physics.
Quantum is a little bit more.
But what about the
It's
four,
inception of
the four
inception.
ways of each
It's
one?
inception of inception.
Yeah. I'm saying this is not a numbers game. That's the point I'm trying to illustrate. This is it's just 100 dimensions doesn't mean 100 dimensions, but I'm just trying to illustrate the system. The system has 100 facets, basically. It's technically an infinite system because each facet has infinite possibilities, but let's leave that for now. Okay? What we need to know is that there are 4 dimensions. Each dimension has 10 Sephiros. Each Sephira has 10 Sephiros. So effectively, there are 4 dimensions of 100 facets. Simply
Linked
put.
to each person.
No, because potentially linked to each person, not necessarily do we access it at all. Okay? So now this is what we need to know for our conversation. Because we could go through all of this, which we're not. We are going to focus on 2 dimensions and 2 Sephiros. That's all we're focusing on, okay? 2 dimensions and 2 Sephiros. So the 2 dimensions we're going to look at are Atzilus, which is the highest meaning, the most connected or most obvious divine experience is called Atzilus, versus Asiya, which is the polar opposite, the least spiritual reality, the least, spiritual is not the right word, the least divine experience that you could have, or alternatively, you could say the one that is most blind to godliness. So those are the 2 we're going to speak about. Why? Because we want to know about the neshama that's stuck in the lowest of the low, and how it can connect to the highest of the highest. So therefore, we're going to speak about the highest, and we're going to speak about the lowest. In each of those systems, we're going to speak about the highest Sephira, which is the first or most developed developed might be a misleading word, but the most powerful out of the 10 Sephiros called Chokhmah. And we're going to speak about Malchus, which is the lowest or least potent, even that's not English trips us up, unfortunately, with these words, out of all the 10. Okay, so you see what we're doing over here? So we're going to compare Malchus in Asiya to Chokhmah in Asiya, and then we're going to compare that to Malchus in Atzilus and Chokhmah in Atzilus, with just one more nuance. On this journey, we're going to get a little bit more specific about Malchus of Atzilus, and within Malchus of Atzilus, we're going to look at the 10 Sephiros again, the Chokhmah and the Malchus within Malchus of Atzilus. Okay, that's what you have to know. So, would it help to have a diagram
You've
for
all
this?
got this, eh?
Maybe to have a diagram would help, but I think you'd actually need an animation. Okay, you need an animation for this. Okay. So let's understand.
Just whatever he said from now. You all got it.
Okay, so you understand. So this is what we're going to do. You ready? We're going to leave the Nefesh, the Malchus Dasia guy behind for a few minutes. We're going to ignore him for a few minutes because we're now teleporting all the way up to the very highest that you could possibly get, the world of Atzilus. We have no clue what Atzilus means. No clue. We just throw out the word. For context, the Alter Rebbe, who wrote the book of Tanya, in all of his years of teaching, never used the word Atzilus, because just saying the word for him was so overwhelming that he would like blank out. So he would just use terms like oiben, that which is above. And when he wrote, he didn't write the name in full either, Atzilus. Because for him it wasn't just terminology like us, for him it was actually an experience.
But yet
Okay.
it is written as a tzilot in the book.
That's the printers.
Other printers,
Okay.
okay.
So, in any event, in that world of Atzilus, for our purposes, the easiest way to explain what the world of Atzilus is to call it the divine image. Meaning, when Hashem chooses to allow us some handle that we could use to relate to Him, that's called the divine image. In other words, I don't want to say, is it correct? We'll get to that in a second. Do we say in our prayers or in the Torah, do we speak about Hashem being kind at any point?
Yeah.
Right, we do, right? Do we speak about Hashem being compassionate? We do, right? Do we speak about Hashem being a king, our king? We
Yeah,
do,
maybe.
right? Okay, so now, why do we have those expressions? So the Gemara tells us it's because Dibra Torah Keloshem B'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks in language which is relatable for us. Otherwise, Hashem would be, you couldn't even have the conversation. So we need things that are relatable. That is the divine image, is when Hashem makes himself accessible to us. So when Hashem, for example, is kind, it's not kind as we know it, but we use the word kind because it makes it relatable for us. So what is Atzilus? That's where you find Hashem's kindness. Hashem himself is way beyond Atzilus. But you want to find Hashem's kindness, you're going to look in Atzilus. You want to find Hashem's compassion, you're going to look in Atzilus. That's where you're going to find it.
What about face and hand?
Okay, good. So, very good question. So, one of the things that you find in the Torah is that we use, and anybody know the correct word for it? Anthropomorphisms, right? Where we use human we use human anatomy to describe divine things. So that's called that's anthropomorphic imagery, right? So that's where you get things like Hashem's face, Hashem's outstretched arm, his right hand, like his eyes. Right, there are various things, anatomical things that we use to refer to
Is it
Hashem.
Hashem's image or is it Hashem's
Well, that was
energy?
my question. Does
Okay,
it
one
mean
sec.
that will-
So let's get to that. Let's first address this. The question is it Hashem's image or is it Hashem's energy? It's a very good question, very valid question. Before we get there, let's just talk about what for us is the easiest way to describe an image is, I know what it looks like. Hashem's face, Hashem's back, Hashem's outstretched arm. It is interesting that the Torah only uses certain repetitive anatomical expressions. Right? You don't really find an expression of Hashem's foot, just as an example, right? So we speak about Hashem's hand, eyes, face, mouth, that kind of thing. So what that really means is that it's the image of his image. Is when we're using anatomy, we're effectively using the image of his image. What do I mean by that? It's really simple. I don't want to get into a whole conversation that's really off topic, so I'm just going to borrow something from a totally different topic just to illustrate the point. And that is anybody who's ever had a paranormal experience, or more specifically, an experience that has to do with ghosts. Right? Now, I'm not going to go around the table over here and find out who has or who hasn't, but you will get different people who will tell you this one sees people and that one hears voices and this one feels a presence. Now, all of those things really, let's say, for argument's sake, that a person walked into a spot and the next thing they see an apparition. There are two possibilities here. The one possibility, which everybody believes to be true, and I personally don't, is that there's actually an apparition there. And then they turn to the person next to them and say, did you see that? Now the person doesn't see that, which then throws into question, if there's actually an apparition, why doesn't the other person see it? What could be much more likely is that a person has some kind of sixth sense that is able to pick up the energy of somebody in an environment, even if that person's no longer alive. And if they're a visual person, then their brain will interpret that energy as an apparition. And the apparition will probably even resemble an individual because, after all, it's their energy. And if a person is an auditory processor, then the brain will interpret the energy as a sound, and it will sound like the person because it's their energy. And if somebody is a kinesthetic processor, then it will be a feeling, right? So that would be, so to speak, the image of their image. You understand what I mean by that? The apparition is not the person. It is an image of the person, which in turn is actually not them. It's their energy. So in a similar kind of way, when the Torah speaks about Hashem's face, Hashem's arm, Hashem's eyes, or any of those things, that's like the image of his image. Meaning to say, it's where his image enters our relatable experience. So I know what a face is. Therefore, I can talk about Hashem's presence and attention as him showing his face. And if I know what an arm is, then I could interpret his kindness or his compassion as him stretching out his arm. You understand what I mean by the image to his image? Therefore, it is correct to say that Atzilus is more his energies, and these anatomical references are his image. The only reason we refer to it as his image is, in the same way as an image can be described, his energies can be described. That's what we mean by an image. Coming back to our conversation. So Malchus is like this Atzilus is this really advanced level that we can't even begin to understand. Malchus of Atzilus. Again, this is the lowest dimension, or not dimension is not the right word. It's the lowest energy within that dimension of Atzilus. Malchus of Atzilus. For our purposes, to make it the most understandable for us, Malchus of Atzilus equals the Creator. The lowest energy of Hashem's so-called image is his creator ability. In the same way as the lowest energy of my system is when I can share. And when I share, things happen. If I talk, people respond. If I act, things are created. So that's Malchus of Atzilus. In Malchus of Atzilus, there is Chochmah of Malchus of Atzilus, and there's Bina of Malchus of Atzilus, and there's all 10 facets. So that's what he's telling us here. You ready? Let's just finish the mapping, and then we can take questions. So that's what we're saying over here. This person's soul is sitting at Nefesh to Malchus Dasiyah. That is as low in the spiritual system as you could possibly get. But despite it being so low, it is still in the spiritual system. Because this Nefesh to Nefesh is living in Malchus, which is a spiritual system. More correctly, it's a divine system. Just happens to be that it's the most diluted version of divine expression. But it is divine. Therefore, it is linked to the rest of the system. So this Malchus of Asiya is an immediate link to Chochmah, the highest energy of Asiya, which in turn is directly linked to what? Can't link to Malchus, to Chochmah of Atzilus. Can't. Because Chochmah of Atzilus is beyond the reach of any created being. Because creation only starts from Malchus of Atzilus. I'm going to say that again because it's maybe a little confusing. The whole of creation starts at Malchus, the lowest energy, of Atzilus, the highest dimension. That's where creation starts. So anything that lives in creation can only plug in to Malchus of Atzilus. That's as high as we can go because that's our point of origin. You can't reach further, deeper, or higher than where you come from. So we come from Malchus of Atzilus. So the highest level we could plug into is Malchus of Atzilus. That's what we can plug into. So where does this lowly soul manage through this wormhole to connect to? Chochmah of Malchus of Atzilus. In other words, the highest point of our creator, of our source of our existence. But the good news is, shebesoicha chochma d'Atzilus. Once you're in the world of Atzilus, the whole of Atzilus is linked. So I can only reach to Malchus of Atzilus, the part of Atzilus that is designed for creation. That's where I could reach. And even though there I could reach Malchus of Atzilus, I can actually get to the highest part of Malchus d'Atzilus, which is called Chochma of Malchus d'Atzilus. But the whole of Atzilus is linked. So Chochma of Malchus of Atzilus is plugged into the real Chochma of Atzilus, which is the highest possible level. Why is it so high? Because that is the level of godliness. That is the level of the system where infinity touches it. Hashem's infinite light touches at that point.
What is the Aleph Samach for?
Ein Sof. Ein Sof. Kidirsiv. And he brings 2 verses for us, and that's where we're going to end, and then we'll take some questions. Kidirsiv, as the pasuk says, Hashem bechochma yosad haaretz. Hashem through chochma, which is not just wisdom as we normally translate it, but rather through the instigation of a whole system. That's how he came to establish the earth, even though establishing the earth took malchus, the power of creation. But what started the whole process, chokhmah, so to speak, you can't say this about Hashem, but so to speak, having the idea to create. And there's another verse which we actually say in our davening, v'kulam b'chokhmah asisa, that Hashem, you made everything with chokhmah. It's a bit of a play on words. Can you see the play on words? B'chokhmah, with chokhmah, here referring to the highest level of chokhmah, asisa, related to the word asiya, that even in the world of asiya, there is access to chokhmah. That's how you created the system. So do I have to know every detail of the technicalities of how it all links up? It'd be a great thing to learn. We've spent a few weeks on it trying to get a bit of a handle on it. But the take home for us is there is a system designed to allow access for the most spiritually retarded, if I dare say, neshama. I don't mean retarded as in that sense, right? We all know, right? There is a retardation of their spirituality, right? That person is able to access the highest level of connection to Hashem. That's what our take-home has to be. We're not completely finished. There's a little bit more, but the real technical, heavy-duty stuff we've pretty much concluded at this point. There's definitely more just to round off the connection to ourselves. We'll do that, please God, next week.
So just a quick question you can ask. So you're saying that there's linking between everything together. Are we going to talk about how does one access the higher level from the lower level?
Okay, so good question.
Rabbi,
So are we going
Malchut
to... What?
Is Malchut not connected to kingdom?
Yes. Okay. So one question at a time. So the first question was, are we going to learn how to use the system? Basically, what do you have? Like the old operators. What plugs you have to plug in to connect to which people. The good news is that the user interface is very easy. The user interface is very easy. It's literally like you have to swipe on your phone. You don't have to know the tech behind it. In our case, you just got to do a mitzvah. You don't have to know the tech of how that makes all those connections happen. That's the simple answer. We'll learn more than that, but that's the simple answer. The other question about whether Malchus translates as kingdom, it does. That's exactly the point, because a king only relates to the rest of the population with the very least of his talents or abilities. He doesn't share his great wisdom with the kingdom. He doesn't share his deep feelings with the kingdom. He just shares his expression, which is basically do this and do that, and this is what I want. So there's that link of Malchus being the lowest or the least powerful, so to speak, of the energies. That's the one that's associated with creation. What were you going to ask before?
I don't know if it's probably related, I'm not sure. You said with the access of creation was the chesed and the malchus.
Chochmah.
I mean chochmah.
So chochmah to malchus is the process.
Is our entry point.
So our entry point is malchus. Therefore, we have access to the chochmah dimension of malchus.
Right.
When I say access, that doesn't mean on demand. It means it's something that we obviously have to work a lot in order to experience.
The question was, does Elohim come into it like a known names of Hashem? Or
Okay, it's a good question.
Different? does the name Elohim sit there?
It's a really interesting question because the name Elohim, so the question was, does the name Elohim relate to this Malchus of Atzilus? So the name Elohim is always the name that is associated with concealment. Right? When Hashem conceals himself, that's Elohim. So for example, nature is associated with the name Elohim because nature is where Hashem conceals himself. The thing is that makes Elohim the mechanism to allow Malchus of Atzilus to exist.
Elohim is the creator by concealing.
Well, Elohim is the facilitator of creation. We wouldn't refer to Hashem as Elohim as the creator necessarily. We might refer to him as well, the creation of the world, for example, is associated with the name Shin Daled Yud. That's the name specifically associated with creation. Okay, but names are tricky because we know that even the names of Hashem don't always manifest simply. For example, you look in Tehillim, sometimes you see the name Elohim is not spelled Elohim, it's spelled Yud Kei Vav Kei, because there are different experiences and dimensions of Elohim itself as well.
Parent Hashem's got how many names? 7. I can't remember.
Don't worry.
But there's a lot. Apparently,
I'm going to say, don't worry, because there's more than what they say.
Okay. So I'm not gonna
Sorry,
say
Russ, and
that.
what were you going to say?
No, I was just digesting.